I guess bread is one of our staples in pretty much every society, some form of bread, whether it's leavened or unleavened bread, whether it's spiced with certain flavors in different countries. But seems to be pretty universal. I don't know, but that may be the reason why Jesus joins us in the simplicity and magnificence of bread. The night before he died, he took the bread of Passover, the unleavened bread, and as he blessed it and broke it, as we say at every consecration, he gave it to his disciples, saying, "Take and eat. This is my body." Now, that's one of our most austere and reverent phrases that we have as Christians, as Roman Catholics especially. Think of Holy Thursday after the Mass. We process the bread of life around the church, and then we put it on a separate altar for reverence through the night. Because that bread that he gave us on the Last Supper is our nourishment, is our hope. Now, Stephen, the deacon who was martyred in today's first reading from the Acts of the Apostles, was not at the Last Supper. His martyrdom maybe took place about 20 years after the Ascension. Presume the Ascension is around 30 something. Okay. He became a deacon. And the role of the deacon created by the apostles was two. One, to serve at tables, and two, to preach the word. Serve at tables means that when people gathered in the earliest days of the church, they didn't gather in pews like this. They gathered in homes. They call those homes domos ecclesiae, house churches. And the wealthy Christians would have opened their houses to these gatherings and offered hospitality to people to come in and sit at tables and eat. And these Domus Ecclesiae were built alongside the homes of Christians, and there are some remnants of them and ruins of them in throughout the world, actually, in the Holy Land as well as other areas in the Middle East. So they were gathering places. That word gathering is significant because it's assembly, and the assembly is the word that eventually in Greek is used as ecclesia, and ecclesia is the word eventually translated into Latin as ecclesia, and Italian chiesa, and in English church. So the gathering, you and me gathered here together, is the church. The building is also our housing for this celebration. So the building of the church is another way of expressing our oneness. See, and that's interesting because you know Catholics as well as I do. Look around the church. Everybody has his or her own spot. We're not all hovered together, sitting in one spot as the church, assembly gathered together. Last week, throughout the event of the eclipse, and I have a lot to say about the eclipse, and I will pepper it into my sermons in the next few weeks, I'm sure. But one thing that stood out, especially when the reporters went to gathering places, usually parks, mountainsides, and so on, the reporters would always turn around and speak to the audience and say, "It's so wonderful. People are all coming together. They're all gathered together to see the moon." Not to see Jesus, to see the moon. And that gathering together still is significant. I'm not downplaying their gathering together. I'm not downplaying the celestial happenings. But it reminds me of how this should be, this building, the church. We should be gathering together. It doesn't mean you have to sit next to each other, but that would be all right too. But the gathering together goes back right to the earliest days of the church. And if Stephen, the apostle, the deacon, were here, he would be assisting at Mass, maybe he would be preaching, and then bring the Eucharist to us, to all of us. That's the role of the deacon. And the gathering is us, all of us together. Now, we gather today for the Eucharist and to ponder the Word. Mass is divided into two parts: Liturgy of the Word, Liturgy of the Table, Eucharist. Did Jesus know that would eventually happen? I don't know. But he certainly gave us plenty to work with when he said, "This is my body, take it and eat." And then in this conversation with the Jews, they want something to eat. They want a sign from heaven. And Jesus said, I am the sign. And they says, give us something. Moses gave the people manna in the desert. No. Moses didn't give you people manna from the desert. My Father gave you manna from the desert. So Jesus always goes to the heart of the matter. And in this section, he presumes what's going to happen at his Last Supper and what happens at every Mass. He gives us himself as the bread of life. That is awesome. There is no Mass that should be less than filled with people. When you see the images of the Vatican on Sunday when the Pope gives his Angelus blessing, or when he speaks to the crowds and crowds and hundreds of people gathered. That should be every day we gather for Mass, because Jesus is present at every Mass. And Jesus gives us himself as the bread of life at every Mass. And he's telling us the Father sent him so he could feed us. Now, don't you think Stephen had a firm grip on that message when they were trying to condemn him and eventually stoned him to death? And what did he do as he was being stoned to death? He had a vision of heaven, God the Father, and Jesus standing at his right side. That's the bread of life. So Stephen seems to have been yearning for a connection with Jesus, a closer connection with Jesus, the closest you can get at the moment of his death. And Jesus appeases him by appearing to him, showing him in glory, showing himself in glory with the Father. The longing that Stephen must have had is awesome. The longing he had for the bread of life. The message had already been preached that Jesus is the bread of life. Not munch bread, not bagels and cream cheese and, rye bread. No, the bread of life he gave us in the Eucharist. And our longing shows that we're here, what we're longing for. Our longing is for the closer connection with Jesus. Each time we get together as an assembly of faith, consciously or unconsciously, we're coming together because we long to be with Jesus as the bread of life. Prayerfully, maybe on the seconds that we close our eyes in death, we'll see Jesus welcoming us into heaven. That's God's gift to us. Whether he gives it or not, it's up to us and our connection with Jesus. But we're here because we hunger for the bread of life. Not the bread that's going to fill our bellies, but the bread that makes sense for us, the bread that gives us the vision of life and the appreciation of life in Jesus. And you know what that comes across as: loving one another, helping one another, treating each other as Jesus would treat us, nourishing each other with prayer and kindness and food at times, always encouraged by the bread of life, the bread that comes down from heaven, Jesus Christ. He is our nourishment. He feeds our minds, He feeds our bellies, and He feeds our hearts and souls with faith. We come together as the Ecclesia of 2024, the church of today, still longing for that same Jesus, and maybe with Stephen as he bows his head in death, speaking to Jesus as the bread of life, who satisfies us into eternal life. What happens on this altar is sacred, giving us the message and the gift from God the Father, the body and blood of His Son Jesus.